During my sophomore year, the scariest thing happened to me. I was struggling with tuition payments like most college kids, so I'd been babysitting to make ends meet. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was easy money, and I genuinely liked kids. The Johnson family had hired me a few times before. They were some of the nicest people I knew. Mr. Johnson was some kind of engineer. Mrs. Johnson worked part-time at the local library. They had two daughters, Emma, who was 8, and little Sophia, who had just turned 5. Both girls were well-behaved, polite, and usually went to bed without much fuss. That Tuesday night in October started like any other babysitting gig. The parents left around 7 for their monthly date night. They'd be back by 11, maybe midnight at the latest. Emma and Sophia had already eaten dinner, so we spent the evening doing typical kid things. We colored in coloring books, played a few rounds of Go Fish, and watched a Disney movie on the couch. The girls were cuddled up on either side of me, sharing a bowl of popcorn and arguing about which princess was the prettiest. Around 9 o'clock, I started the bedtime routine. Emma was old enough to handle most of it herself, brushing teeth, washing face, picking out clothes for the next day. She was the responsible older sister type, always trying to help with Sophia and make sure everything was in order. But Sophia was different that night. Usually, she was the easier one to put to bed. She'd brush her teeth without complaint, listen to a quick story, and drift off to sleep within minutes. But that night, she seemed anxious, fidgety. She kept looking over her shoulder while we walked up the stairs, and when we got to her bedroom, she hesitated at the doorway. Sophia's room was on the second floor, painted pale pink with white furniture, very much a little girl's sanctuary. Her bed was positioned against the far wall, with enough space underneath for storage boxes and, unfortunately, for a small child's imagination to run wild. She stood in her doorway in her little purple pajamas with the cartoon cats on them, clutching her stuffed rabbit, a raggedy thing she'd had since she was a baby. Her eyes were wide, darting between me and her bed. I asked her what was wrong. At first, she just shook her head and said she didn't want to go to sleep yet. Normal stalling tactics. I'd seen it 100 times before, but when I guided her toward the bed, she dug her heels in. She told me she didn't want to sleep in her room that night. I knelt down to her level and asked why. That's when she whispered the words that should have made me listen more carefully. There was something under her bed, something that didn't belong there. Now, I dealt with this kind of thing before. Kids have active imaginations. They see shadows and think they're monsters. They hear the house settling and convince themselves something is moving around. So I did what any responsible babysitter would do. I decided to show her there was nothing to be afraid of. I sat her down on the edge of the bed and explained that we were going to check together. I told her that sometimes our minds play tricks on us, especially when we're tired, and that once we looked under the bed and saw it was empty, she'd feel much better. She shook her head frantically. She didn't want me to look. She wanted to sleep somewhere else. But I was 19 and thought I knew better. I was the adult. I was supposed to be rational, calm, reassuring. I was supposed to prove to this scared little girl that monsters weren't real. So I got down on my hands and knees next to her bed. Sophia was standing behind me, still clutching that stuffed rabbit, making these little whimpering sounds. I remember thinking how sweet it was that she was so concerned about me confronting her imaginary monster. I reached for the bed skirt, that decorative fabric that hangs down to hide the space under the bed. My hand was shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the effort of trying not to laugh. I was about to show this little girl that there was nothing under her bed but dust bunnies and maybe a few forgotten toys. I lifted the bed skirt, and that's when my entire world changed. There was a man under the bed. Not a shadow, not a trick of the light, not a child's imagination run wild. A real living, breathing human being, lying on his side in the narrow space beneath Sophia's mattress, staring directly at me with dark, calculating eyes. For a split second, maybe less than that, maybe just a heartbeat, we looked at each other. He was middle-aged, unshaven, wearing dark clothes that helped him blend into the shadows. His face was maybe 2 feet from mine, every second screaming that this was no random break-in. He'd been waiting, plotting, ready. I don't remember making the decision to scream. The sound just tore out of my throat, primal and terrified. It was the kind of scream that comes from the deepest part of your survival instincts. The sound you make when your brain realizes that everything you thought you knew about safety and security has just been shattered. Sophia started crying immediately. Not just crying, wailing like she'd been holding in her terror all evening and finally had permission to let it out. I scrambled backwards, still on my hands and knees, trying to get away from the bed, trying to get to Sophia, trying to process what I'd just seen. The man under the bed didn't move at first. He just kept staring at me with those cold, calculating eyes, like he was deciding what to do next. And that's what scared me the most, the calculation. This wasn't some panicked burglar caught in the act. This was someone who had been planning this moment. I grabbed Sophia, lifted her right off her feet, and ran. I didn't think about grabbing shoes or my purse or anything else. I just ran, carrying this sobbing 5-year-old, heading for Emma's room first because I couldn't leave her behind. Emma was already awake. She'd heard my scream and was standing in her doorway, confused and frightened. I told her we had to go, now, immediately, and to my credit, she didn't ask questions. She just followed as I carried Sophia toward the stairs. That's when I heard it, the sound of someone moving around in Sophia's room. Not trying to be quiet anymore. Heavy footsteps, like he was getting up from under the bed, maybe looking for another way out, maybe deciding whether to follow us. We made it to the bathroom on the first floor, the only room with a lock that I trusted. I shoved both girls inside, locked the door, and fumbled for my phone. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial 911. The dispatcher was professional and calm, asking for details, while I tried to explain that there was an intruder in the house, that he'd been hiding under a child's bed, that we were locked in the bathroom, and I didn't know where he was now. Emma was holding Sophia, both of them crying quietly while I whispered frantically into the phone. The dispatcher kept me on the line, asking if I could hear any sounds of movement, whether I was sure the bathroom door was locked, whether the children were injured. We stayed in that bathroom for what felt like hours, but was probably only about 15 minutes. Every sound made us jump. Footstep creeping closer, a door's faint creak echoing through the house. He was still inside, wasn't he? Lurking, waiting for us to slip out, his presence a tightening noose around our hiding place. When the police arrived, they searched the entire house. They found the window in the basement that had been jimmied open. That's how he'd gotten in. They found evidence that he'd been in the house for a while, maybe hours. There were signs that he'd been through the parents' bedroom, the kitchen, and other areas of the house. But he was gone. Somehow, in the chaos after I screamed, he'd managed to escape. It took the police less than 24 hours to identify him. He was a 34-year-old man with a history of breaking and entering, and here's the part that still makes my blood run cold, he used to live in that house. The Johnson family had bought it from the previous owners about 2 years earlier, but before that, Villalobos had lived there with his ex-girlfriend and her children. The ex-girlfriend had a restraining order against him. Apparently, he'd been obsessed with her kids, particularly her young daughter, and had shown up at the house multiple times after she'd kicked him out. But no one had told the Johnsons about this history when they bought the house. He was caught the next day at a motel about 50 miles away. He confessed to breaking into the house multiple times over the past month, always when the family wasn't home, sometimes just to look around, sometimes to steal small items that wouldn't be missed immediately. But that night was different. That night, he'd planned to wait until everyone was asleep. He'd planned to take Sophia. The prosecutor said that if I hadn't lifted that bed skirt, if I hadn't listened to Sophia's fears and decided to reassure her by checking under the bed, he probably would have succeeded. The family would have woken up in the morning to find their youngest daughter missing, and by then, he would have been long gone. I never babysat again after that. I couldn't. Every time I looked at a child's bed, every time a kid complained about monsters in their room, every time I heard a house settling in the quiet of the evening, I remembered those eyes staring back at me from the darkness. You know how some houses just feel wrong the second you walk in? The Morrison place was like that. 3 stories of dark wood and narrow hallways that seemed to stretch forever. I'd been babysitting Tommy Morrison for 3 months, 8 years old, red hair, freckles. The kid was an angel compared to most of the brats I watched. But that house, every time I walked through that front door, the hair on my arms stood up. The first thing you noticed was how cold it was. Not just chilly, cold in a way that seeped into your bones and stayed there. Mrs. Morrison always apologized for it, saying the heating system was old. But I've been in old houses before. This was different. The second floor was the worst. Long hallway with doors on both sides, and at the very end, this heavy wooden door. Solid oak, had to be. With this old brass lock that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The first time I saw it, I asked Mrs. Morrison what was up there. Her face went white, just completely drained of color. She laughed it off, said it was storage, old family stuff, but her hands were shaking when she said it. And she actually made me promise, to never go near that door. So naturally, I became obsessed with it. Every time I put Tommy to bed, I'd catch myself staring down that hallway. The door was always closed, always locked. But sometimes I swear I could hear things. October 23rd. I remember the date because it was the night before Tommy's school Halloween party. Mrs. Morrison had left early for some work thing, said she'd be back by 11. Mr. Morrison was out of town. Tommy went down easy that night. I tucked him in around 8:30, turned on his nightlight, left his door cracked open like always. Then I went downstairs, spread my textbooks on the coffee table, and tried to focus on my psychology homework. The baby monitor was crackling softly beside me. You know how those things pick up everything? Tommy rolling over, the house settling, even cars passing outside. I was used to all those sounds by now. That's why I noticed when something changed. One footstep, right above my head. I looked up at the ceiling, pen frozen in my hand. Waited. Nothing. Slow, heavy steps moving across the floor upstairs. My first thought was Tommy. Maybe he'd gotten up for water or to use the bathroom, but these weren't kid footsteps. These were adult steps, measured, deliberate. And they were moving back and forth, like someone pacing. I grabbed the monitor, turned up the volume. Tommy's room was dead silent. I could see the little green lights showing sound levels, and they weren't moving at all. He was fast asleep. But the pacing upstairs was getting louder, more insistent, like whoever it was had somewhere to be and was getting impatient about it. I couldn't just sit there. I set down my pen, turned down the TV, and listened. The footsteps were definitely coming from the far end of the hall, past Tommy's room, past the bathroom, from the direction of that locked door. Every step up those stairs felt like walking underwater. The air got thicker, colder. By the time I reached the second floor, I could see my breath. The hallway stretched out in front of me, dark except for the moonlight coming through the window at the far end. Tommy's door was still cracked, still quiet, but past his room, the pacing stopped. Just like that, complete silence. I took one step forward. The old floorboard under my foot let out this long, slow creak that seemed to echo forever. I froze, listening. That's when I heard it. Soft at first, so quiet I thought I was imagining it. Music. Coming from behind that locked door, a lullaby. It wasn't like any music box I'd ever heard. The notes were too pure, too perfect. They hung in the air like they were being held by invisible hands. I found myself walking toward the door without deciding to. Each step felt automatic, like something else was controlling my legs. The music was getting clearer, more beautiful. But there was something underneath it, something that made my stomach twist. The brass doorknob was right in front of me. Old, tarnished, covered in scratches like someone had tried to claw it open. I reached out my hand. The metal was so cold it burned, like touching dry ice. But I couldn't pull my hand away. The lullaby was coming from right behind the door now. Not one voice, but two. A woman's voice, sweet and gentle. And underneath it, something else. A child's voice. High and thin and wrong somehow. Then everything stopped. The music, the cold, even the feeling in my hand. The hallway was dead silent again, but this time it felt like the silence before a scream. Headlights swept across the hallway window. A car door slammed. Mrs. Morrison was home early. I ran. Didn't think about it, just ran down those stairs faster than I'd ever moved in my life. By the time Mrs. Morrison's key turned in the lock, I was back on the couch, textbook open, trying to look normal. But she didn't look normal. Mrs. Morrison stepped through that door looking like she'd seen a ghost. Her usually perfect hair was falling out of its bun, her makeup was smeared, and her hands Her hands were shaking so hard she could barely set down her purse. She didn't say hello, didn't ask how Tommy was. She just stood there at the bottom of the stairs, looking up, listening, the same way I'd been listening just minutes before. When she finally looked at me, her eyes were wild, not scared, terrified, like she'd been running from something and wasn't sure if it had followed her home. She walked over to me, knelt down next to the couch and grabbed my arm. Her fingers were ice cold, and she was gripping so tight it hurt. She whispered, actually whispered, that I needed to stay away from the upstairs hallway after dark, not just the attic door, the entire hallway. She said some things needed to stay undisturbed, and some doors were locked to keep things in, not to keep people out. I wanted to tell her about the footsteps, about the lullaby, but something in her face stopped me. This wasn't a woman who would be surprised to hear those things. This was a woman who already knew exactly what I'd experienced. She paid me without another word. I grabbed my books and left, but I could feel her watching me from the window as I walked to my car. When I looked back, she was still standing there, silhouetted against the light, staring up at that second floor. I never went back. The next week, Mrs. Morrison called and said they'd found someone else. She didn't explain why. Didn't need to.